The Galactic Council had ruled the known universe for 50,000 years. 12 ancient alien species sat on this council, and they believed themselves to be the supreme masters of all intelligent life. They had conquered hundreds of worlds and enslaved dozens of younger civilizations. No one had ever dared to challenge their authority. No one had ever said no to their demands. This was simply how the galaxy worked, and they expected it to remain this way forever. High Arbiter Xyloth of the Valorian Dominion was the current leader of the council. He was a tall creature with gray skin and 4 arms. His species had been among the founding members of the council, and they considered themselves superior to all other beings in existence. When his scientists reported that they had detected stringed radio signals coming from a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, Xyloth barely paid attention. Another primitive species had discovered basic technology. This happened every few centuries, and the outcome was always the same. The council would send a diplomatic envoy. The primitive species would be given 2 choices. They could submit to council authority and become a servant race, providing resources and labor for their new masters. Or they could refuse and face complete annihilation. In 50,000 years, only 3 species had chosen the second option. None of them existed anymore. Xyloth assigned Ambassador Crystal to handle this matter. Crystal was an insectoid creature from the Hive Collective. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, and his body was covered in a hard black shell. His compound eyes could see in multiple spectrums, and his mandibles clicked together when he spoke. He had delivered the Council's ultimatum to 17 different species during his long career. All 17 had submitted within hours of his arrival. 3 Council cruisers carried the ambassador and his staff toward the small blue planet. The journey took several weeks through hyperspace, and during this time, Crystal studied what little information they had gathered about these new creatures. They called themselves humans. They had 2 arms, 2 legs, and soft skin, with no natural armor or weapons. They had only recently developed space travel, and their fastest ships could barely reach a fraction of light speed. Their entire civilization was confined to a single star system. By any measure, they were utterly insignificant. The cruisers emerged from hyperspace near the 4th planet of the human system. It was a red, dusty world with a thin atmosphere. Crystal noted that the humans had established small colonies here, which showed some ambition, at least. His fleet continued toward the 3rd planet, the blue world where the humans had originated. As they approached, Crystal received a transmission. A human face appeared on his screen. It was an older male with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He wore a uniform of dark blue with golden decorations on his shoulders. He introduced himself as Admiral George Carter of the United Earth Navy and asked the alien vessels to state their purpose. Crystal was amused by this display of authority. He explained that he was Ambassador Crystal of the Galactic Council and that he had come to deliver terms of surrender. The humans would immediately submit to Council authority. They would provide tribute in the form of resources and workers. They would dismantle their military forces and accept Council oversight of their government. In exchange, the humans would be allowed to continue existing. Admiral Carter listened without any change in his expression. When Crystal finished speaking, the human remained silent for several long moments. Then he did something that no species had ever done before. He said no. Crystal was certain he had misunderstood. He asked the human to repeat himself. Admiral Carter spoke slowly and clearly. He said that humanity would not surrender. He said that humanity would not submit to any foreign authority. He said that Earth was humanity's home and they would defend it against anyone who threatened them. The ambassador felt his mandibles clicking together in agitation. He warned the human that the Council commanded a fleet of thousands of warships. He warned that entire civilizations had been erased for showing such disrespect. He demanded that Carter reconsider his foolish response. Carter leaned forward slightly. His blue eyes seemed to grow even colder. He told Crystal that humanity had spent most of its history fighting amongst itself. They had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. They had split the atom and walked on their moon. They had clawed their way up from caves to reach the stars. And now some alien was telling them to kneel. Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said that humanity did not kneel. Crystal ended the transmission abruptly. He paced back and forth across his ship's bridge, trying to process what had just happened. In 200 years of diplomatic service, no one had ever spoken to him this way. These humans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Perhaps both. He sent an urgent message back to Nexra Prime, the Council's capital world. He reported that the humans had rejected the ultimatum and recommended immediate military action. The response came directly from High Arbiter Xyloth himself. A war fleet would be assembled at once. The combined fleet of all 12 Council species would descend upon this arrogant young race and teach them the price of defiance. Crystal informed Admiral Carter of this development. He expected fear or perhaps a plea for mercy. Instead, Carter simply nodded and said that humanity would be waiting. The transmission ended, and the Council cruisers began their journey back to report in person. As the alien ships departed, Admiral Carter remained on the bridge of his command station. His aide, a young woman named Lieutenant Patricia Coleman, approached him carefully. She asked if he truly believed they could fight the entire Galactic Council. Carter turned to look out the viewport at the stars beyond. He told her that 15 years ago, humanity had discovered an alien probe in deep space. They had learned that they were not alone in the universe. They had also learned that the galaxy was ruled by beings who viewed younger species as nothing more than slaves or pests to be exterminated. From that moment, humanity had begun preparing. Every nation on Earth had united under a single government. Every resource had been directed toward building a fleet capable of defending their world. They had worked in secret, hidden from the Council's censors, knowing that one day this moment would come. Patricia asked what they had built. Carter smiled again, but this time there was genuine warmth in it. He said that she would see soon enough. Everyone would see. The Council thought they were dealing with primitives who had barely left their homeworld. They had no idea what humanity was truly capable of. And by the time they learned the truth, it would be far too late. Outside the viewport, the stars continued to shine as they had for billions of years. But everything was about to change. Humanity's greatest test was coming, and George Carter intended to make sure they passed it. The news of humanity's defiance spread across the galaxy within days. Every species that served the Council heard the story. A young civilization on a tiny blue world had rejected the ultimatum. They had looked upon the might of the Galactic Council and told them no. Some felt admiration for the humans. Most felt pity. They knew what was coming. The Grand Assembly Hall on Nexra Prime was the largest structure in the known galaxy. It had been built 40,000 years ago from a single piece of crystal harvested from a dying star. The hall could hold representatives from 1,000 different species, and its walls had witnessed countless historic moments. But the meeting that took place on this day would be remembered long after all others were forgotten. High Arbiter Xyloth stood at the central podium. His gray skin seemed to glow under the lights, and his forearms were spread wide as he addressed the gathered representatives. He spoke of the humans with contempt dripping from every word. These creatures were barely more than animals, he declared. They had emerged from their caves only a few thousand years ago. Their technology was primitive. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were laughable. The fact that they had dared to defy the Council was an insult that could not be tolerated. Ambassador Crystal provided his report next. He described his encounter with Admiral Carter and the strange behavior he had witnessed. The humans showed no fear, he explained. They did not beg or bargain. They simply refused and waited to see what would happen next. It was unlike anything he had experienced in his long career. The representatives from the various council species began to discuss the appropriate response. Most agreed that a swift and overwhelming show of force was necessary. The humans needed to be crushed completely. Their planet would be burned, and their species would be erased from existence. This would serve as a warning to any other civilization that might consider rebellion. Only one voice urged caution. Arbitress Desha of the Mindari Collective rose from her seat and asked permission to speak. The Mindari were a delicate species with large dark eyes and pale blue skin. They possessed limited telepathic abilities that allowed them to sense the emotions of other beings. Desha had scanned the human delegation during their encounter with Krikstal, and what she had found disturbed her deeply. She explained that most species, when faced with the Council's ultimatum, projected fear and desperation. This was natural and expected. But the humans were different. Their minds burned with something else entirely. It was a strange mixture of emotions that the Mindari had never encountered before. There was anger, but it was not the hot rage of a cornered animal. It was cold and patient and controlled. There was also something that resembled excitement, as if the humans were looking forward to the coming conflict. Desha warned that the humans might not be what they appeared. A species that felt no fear when facing annihilation was not a species to be underestimated. She recommended sending scouts to gather more information before committing the full fleet. Xyloth dismissed her concerns with a wave of his upper arms. The Mindari were always seeing threats where none existed, he declared. The humans were primitive and weak. Their largest warship was reportedly only 2 kilometers long. The Council's dreadnoughts were 8 kilometers of pure destruction. There was no scenario in which the humans could survive a direct confrontation. The vote was held and the decision was nearly unanimous. The combined fleet would be assembled. 400 warships from all 12 Council species would gather at the staging point near the Valorian homeworld. From there, they would travel to the human system and demonstrate the true power of the Galactic Council. Grand Admiral Vecna was chosen to command this mighty force. He was a Valorian like Xyloth, with the same gray skin and 4 arms. But while Xyloth was a politician, Vecna was a warrior. He had commanded council forces for 300 years and had never lost a single engagement. Dozens of rebellions had been crushed under his leadership. Entire species had surrendered at the mere mention of his name. Vecna accepted the command with quiet confidence. He studied the intelligence reports on the humans and found them unimpressive. Their navy consisted of approximately 50 vessels, none larger than 2 kilometers. Their weapons appeared to be based on simple kinetic projectiles and basic energy beams. They had no experience fighting a galactic-level conflict. This would not even qualify as a battle. It would be an execution. The assembly of the fleet took 30 standard cycles. Ships arrived from all corners of Council space. There were the massive Valorian dreadnoughts with their heavy armor and devastating plasma cannons. There were the sleek Mindari cruisers designed for speed and precision strikes. There were the Hive Collective's carrier vessels, each one housing thousands of drone fighters. There were warships of every design and configuration, representing 50,000 years of military development. When the fleet was complete, it stretched across space for hundreds of kilometers. The combined firepower could crack planets and extinguish stars. Looking upon this armada, even Arbitress Desha began to doubt her earlier concerns. Surely no primitive species could stand against such overwhelming force. Grand Admiral Vecna addressed his captains through a fleet-wide transmission. He reminded them of their duty to the Council and to the natural order of the galaxy. Lesser species existed to serve their betters. The humans had forgotten their place, and now they would be taught a lesson that the entire galaxy would remember. There would be no mercy and no survivors. The human homeworld would burn, and its people would become nothing more than a cautionary tale. The fleet engaged its hyperspace drives and began the journey toward the distant human system. 400 ships carrying over 1 million crew members moved as one toward their destination. Every captain was confident of victory. Every soldier expected to return home as a hero. None of them noticed a small object drifting in the shadow of a nearby moon. It was a human probe, no larger than a standard escape pod. Its surface was coated with materials that absorbed sensor beams. Its systems operated on minimal power to avoid detection. And inside its memory banks, every detail of the Council's fleet had been recorded as the Armada disappeared into hyperspace. The probe transmitted its findings to a receiver station hidden in an asteroid field 3 systems away. From there, the information was relayed through a network of hidden satellites until it reached its final destination. Admiral George Carter read the report in his command center on Earth. The fleet was larger than expected. 400 warships instead of the estimated 200. But Carter had prepared for this possibility. He opened a secure channel to a facility on the far side of the moon. A face appeared on the screen. It was Commander Daniel Price, a younger man with dark hair and determined brown eyes. Carter asked if they were ready. Price confirmed that everything was in place. The weapon that humanity had spent 15 years building was finally complete. It was time to show the galaxy what humans could do when their backs were against the wall. The far side of Earth's moon had been humanity's greatest secret for 15 years. While the Council's sensors watched the visible side and monitored human activity in the solar system, they never thought to look behind that gray rocky sphere. They assumed that a primitive species would have no reason to hide anything. This assumption would prove to be their greatest mistake. Commander Daniel Price stood on the observation deck of Lunar Base Omega and looked down at the construction yards below. The facility stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the moon's surface. Tens of thousands of workers had labored here in complete secrecy. Entire mountains had been hollowed out to create foundries and assembly halls. The project had consumed more resources than everything else humanity had ever built combined. And now, after 15 years of work, it was finally complete. The USS Colossus floated in the construction dock like a sleeping giant. At 12 kilometers in length, it dwarfed every other vessel humanity had ever created. Its hull was forged from an alloy that did not exist in any Council database. Scientists had developed it by studying the wreckage of an alien scout ship that had crashed in the Arctic Ocean decades ago. This alloy was stronger than anything the Council used for their own warships. It could withstand temperatures that would vaporize ordinary metals. And it had another property that made it perfect for what humanity had planned. Price took a transport shuttle down to the dock and boarded the Colossus through its main hangar. The interior of the ship was a maze of corridors and chambers that would take hours to walk from end to end. Every system had been designed with one purpose in mind. This vessel was built to fight and to win against enemies that should have been impossible to defeat. The bridge was located at the center of the ship, protected by dozens of armored bulkheads. Price walked through the final security checkpoint and entered the command center. It was a large circular room filled with control stations and display screens. Officers moved between their positions, running final checks on every system. The ship was scheduled to launch within hours, and there was no room for error. Lieutenant Commander Amy Grant looked up from her tactical station as Price entered. She was a small woman with short red hair and sharp green eyes. Her specialty was weapon systems, and she had spent the last decade helping to design the Colossus's offensive capabilities. She reported that all primary and secondary weapon arrays were operational. The main cannon was charged and ready. Point defense systems were online. Missile tubes were loaded and standing by. Price nodded and moved to the engineering station, where Chief Engineer Kevin Moore was monitoring the ship's power systems. Moore was a large man with calloused hands and a thick beard. He had overseen the construction of the Colossus's revolutionary engines and knew every component personally. He reported that the reactor was operating at optimal capacity. Power distribution was stable across all grids, and the experimental faster-than-light drive was ready for activation. This drive was humanity's second greatest secret. The Council believed that their hyperspace technology was the fastest method of interstellar travel. Their scientists had declared that nothing could exceed those speeds without tearing itself apart. They were wrong. Human physicists had discovered a different approach, one that allowed for speeds the Council believed were physically impossible. The Colossus could cross the galaxy in days rather than weeks. It could appear anywhere without warning and disappear before the enemy could react. Lieutenant Nicole Harris sat at the communications station, monitoring transmissions from across the solar system. She was young, barely 25 years old, but she had proven herself to be one of the best signals analysts in the fleet. She reported that the Council fleet had entered hyperspace and was on course for the Sol system. Based on their estimated speed, they would arrive in approximately 18 hours. Price called for a senior staff meeting in the briefing room adjacent to the bridge. Grant, Moore, and Harris joined him around a holographic display that showed the tactical situation. The enemy fleet consisted of 400 warships of various classes. The largest were the Valorian dreadnoughts, 8 kilometers of heavy armor and powerful weapons. There were also cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, each designed for specific combat roles. Against this armada, humanity had 50 standard warships and a Colossus. Grant raised the obvious question. Even with the Colossus, they were still outnumbered 8-1. Could they really win against those odds? Price answered by bringing up specifications for the main weapon system. The primary cannon of the Colossus was a directed energy weapon of unprecedented power. It drew energy directly from the ship's reactor and focused it through a series of amplification chambers. A single shot carried enough force to punch through even the thickest armor. In tests conducted on remote asteroids, the weapon had shattered objects larger than the Council's dreadnoughts, but the cannon was only one part of their arsenal. The Colossus also carried 3,000 missile tubes, each loaded with warheads designed to penetrate Council shields. Its broadside batteries could fill space with continuous fire. Its fighter bays housed 200 strike craft piloted by the best humans had to offer, and its advanced sensors could track and target every enemy vessel simultaneously. Moore added that the ship's armor was effectively immune to Council weapons. The alloy absorbed energy attacks and redistributed the force across its entire surface. Kinetic weapons would simply bounce off. The enemy would need to hit the same spot hundreds of times to create even a small breach. By the time they figured this out, the battle would already be over. A transmission came through from Earth. Admiral Carter's face appeared on the display. He asked Price if the Colossus was ready to launch. Price confirmed that all systems were operational, and the crew was standing by. Carter gave the order. The Colossus would lead the defense of humanity. The smaller warships would support it and engage targets of opportunity. There would be no retreat and no surrender. If they failed here, Earth would burn and the human race would cease to exist. But Carter did not believe they would fail. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived. They would survive this too. Price ended the transmission and returned to the bridge. He took his position in the command chair and looked around at his crew. These men and women had trained for years for this moment. They knew what was at stake, and they were ready. Price gave the order, and the Colossus began to move. Engines that had never been tested in combat roared to life. The massive vessel rose from the construction dock and cleared the lunar surface. It turned toward open space and accelerated, heading for the point where the enemy fleet would emerge. Behind it, the rest of humanity's navy fell into formation, 50 ships following one giant into the fight of their lives. The Titan had awakened, and the galaxy was about to learn why humanity had survived for so long. Grand Admiral Veckener stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Valorian dreadnought Eternal Dominion. He watched through the main viewport as stars stretched into lines and then returned to points of light. The fleet had emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the human system. 400 warships spread out behind him in perfect formation. This was the largest military force the Council had deployed in over 1,000 years. His tactical officer reported contacts near the third planet. Approximately 50 human vessels had formed a defensive line between the fleet and their homeworld. Veckener studied the display and felt nothing but contempt. The humans were brave, he admitted, but bravery alone would not save them. Their largest ship was barely 2 kilometers long. His own flagship was 4 times that size. He gave the order to advance. The fleet moved forward in standard conquest formation, with the dreadnoughts at the center and smaller vessels protecting the flanks. Fighters launched from the carrier ships and swarmed ahead like insects. Every weapon system was armed and ready. Veckener expected the battle to last no more than an hour. As the fleet approached, a sensor officer reported an anomaly. Something large was emerging from behind the human's moon. Veckener demanded clarification. The officer's voice trembled as he provided the readings. The object was 12 kilometers in length. It was bigger than anything the Council had ever built. It was heading directly toward them. The USS Colossus revealed itself to the galaxy. Commander Daniel Price stood at the center of his bridge, watching the tactical display as his ship cleared the moon's shadow. He could see the enemy fleet spread out before him. 400 vessels, each one confident in their superiority. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Lieutenant Commander Amy Grant reported that all weapons were locked and ready. Price gave her the order to fire. The main cannon of the Colossus discharged for the first time in combat. A beam of concentrated energy, blindingly white and impossibly bright, crossed the distance between the 2 fleets in less than a second. It struck the lead Valorian dreadnought directly in its center mass. The 8-kilometer warship, the pride of the Valorian Navy, was cut in half like paper. Both sections exploded moments later in a burst of fire and debris. Silence fell across the Council fleet's communication channels. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then chaos erupted. Officers shouted in dozens of languages. Captains demanded to know what had happened. The Valorian dreadnoughts were supposed to be indestructible. Nothing should have been able to destroy one with a single shot. Veckener shouted for order and demanded a damage report. His tactical officer informed him that the lead dreadnought was gone. All 3,000 crew members were dead, and the human ship was charging for another shot. The Colossus fired again. Another dreadnought vanished in a flash of light. Then another, and another. Each shot found its target with perfect accuracy. Each impact resulted in total destruction. In the span of 2 minutes, 7 of the Council's largest warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Panic spread through the fleet. Ships began to break formation as captains tried to evade the devastating beams. Lieutenant Nicole Harris intercepted transmissions from dozens of vessels. They were all variations of the same desperate message: retreat, fall back, run. But Commander Price had no intention of letting them escape. He opened a channel to the rest of humanity's fleet and gave the order to engage. The 50 human warships surged forward, their engines burning at maximum power. They dove into the disorganized alien formation like wolves among sheep. human destroyers targeted the Council's cruisers, pouring fire into their shields until they collapsed. Human frigates engaged the enemy fighters, cutting through swarms of drones with precise volleys. Human missile boats launched their payloads at the larger vessels, overwhelming their point defense systems with sheer numbers. Grant reported that the enemy was attempting to concentrate fire on the Colossus. Hundreds of weapons were targeting their position. Price watched as beams and projectiles streaked toward his ship. They struck the hull and did nothing. The advanced armor absorbed every hit. Not a single shot penetrated. The Council's weapons were useless against them. Price ordered the Colossus to advance. The massive vessel moved forward, still firing its main cannon at the larger enemy ships. Its broadside batteries came to life, filling space with a continuous barrage. Explosions boomed across the Council formation as vessel after vessel was torn apart. Admiral Vecna watched his fleet crumble around him. Ships that had served the Council for centuries were being destroyed in seconds. His tactical display was filled with red icons indicating lost vessels. 350 ships remained. Then 300. Then 250. He ordered a retreat. The remaining ships would fall back to hyperspace and regroup. But the human fleet was already among them, preventing any organized withdrawal. Vessels that tried to run were hunted down and destroyed. Those that stayed to fight fared no better. The Eternal Dominion shuddered as multiple impacts struck its hull. Alarms blared and damage reports flooded the bridge. A human destroyer had positioned itself behind the flagship and was pouring fire into its engines. Vecna ordered all weapons to target the attacker, but before his gunners could comply, the Colossus turned its main cannon toward him. The beam struck the Eternal Dominion in its engineering section. The flagship's reactor went critical instantly. Vecna had just enough time to send a final transmission to the Council. He told them that he had been wrong about everything. Then his world turned to white light. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the space around Earth was filled with debris and wreckage. Of the 400 Council ships that had arrived, fewer than 60 managed to escape into hyperspace. The rest were destroyed. Over 1 million alien crew members had died. Humanity had lost 7 ships and approximately 2,000 personnel. It was a price that weighed heavily on Commander Price, but it was far less than anyone had expected. Admiral Carter's voice came through the communication system, congratulating the fleet on their victory. But he warned them that this was only the beginning. The survivors would return to the Council with news of what had happened. The galaxy would learn that humanity had teeth. And then the real challenges would begin. Price looked out at the debris field that had once been the mightiest fleet in the galaxy. He thought about the aliens who had come to enslave his people. They had expected easy prey. They had found something very different. Humanity had proven that it belonged among the stars. Now they would have to prove that they could survive there. The survivors of the combined fleet limped back to Nexera Prime over the following days. Their ships were battered and scarred, bearing the marks of weapons that should not have existed. Of the 400 vessels that had departed with such confidence, fewer than 60 returned. Grand Admiral Vecna was among the dead. So were most of his senior officers. The greatest military defeat in 50,000 years had occurred in a single afternoon. High Arbiter Xyloth received the reports in his private chambers before the emergency session of the Council. He read the numbers again and again, unable to accept what they told him. 340 ships destroyed. Over 1 million crew members killed. 7 dreadnoughts, the backbone of Council military power, erased from existence. And the humans had lost only 7 vessels. The Grand Assembly Hall was silent as the surviving captains delivered their accounts. They described a nightmare made real. They spoke of a human warship larger than anything the Council had ever built. They described weapons that cut through their strongest armor like it was nothing. They reported that their own attacks had been completely ineffective. The human vessel had absorbed everything they threw at it without showing any damage. Ambassador Krickstall, who had survived the battle aboard a retreating cruiser, provided his assessment when asked. He stood before the assembled representatives and spoke without his usual arrogance. The humans, he explained, were not like other species the Council had encountered. They had evolved on a world that seemed designed to kill them. Their planet had predators and disasters and diseases that would have wiped out most civilizations. But the humans had survived. More than survived. They had thrived. They had conquered their world and then turned their attention to the stars. War was not something the humans avoided. It was part of their nature. They had spent their entire history fighting each other, developing better and better ways to kill. When they learned about the Council, they did not despair or surrender. They simply began preparing for the next war. Every resource their civilization possessed had been directed toward building weapons that could defeat their new enemies. And they had succeeded beyond anything the Council could have imagined. Arbitress, Desha of the Mindari Collective, did not say the words that everyone was thinking. She did not need to remind them that she had warned against this attack. The evidence of their failure was written in the casualty reports and the traumatized faces of the surviving crews. The Council's arrogance had led them to the greatest disaster in their long history. Xyloth demanded suggestions for how to respond. Some representatives called for assembling an even larger fleet. Surely the humans could not defeat the entire combined military power of 12 civilizations. Others argued for more cautious approaches. Perhaps blockading the human system and starving them into submission would work. Before any decision could be reached, a censor officer interrupted the proceedings with an urgent report. A single vessel had entered the Nexera system. It had not used hyperspace. It had simply appeared near the outer planets as if emerging from nowhere. The vessel was 12 kilometers long. It was the human warship. The USS Colossus had traveled across the galaxy in 3 days. The Council's fastest ships would have needed weeks to cover the same distance. Commander Daniel Price stood on his bridge, looking at the alien capital world through the main viewport. It was a beautiful planet with swirling clouds and vast oceans. Billions of beings lived on its surface. All of them were now within range of his weapons. Admiral Carter's voice came through the secure communication system. The Admiral was still on Earth, but his message had been transmitted instantly through the quantum link that connected the Colossus to home. He reminded Price of his mission. They were not here to conquer or destroy. They were here to deliver a message. Price opened a channel to the planet below. He identified himself as the commander of the human vessel and requested to speak with the Galactic Council. The response came within minutes. High Arbiter Xyloth's face appeared on the screen. Looking older and more tired than he had in the recordings Price had studied. Price spoke clearly and without emotion. He explained that humanity had no interest in conquest or domination. They did not wish to destroy the Council or enslave its member species. They simply wanted to be left alone. They wanted to develop their civilization in peace and explore the galaxy on their own terms. They wanted to be treated as equals, not as servants or prey. However, Price continued, any future aggression against humanity would be met with overwhelming force. The battle at Sol had demonstrated what happened when the Council underestimated human capabilities. If they made that mistake again, the next battle would not take place in human space. It would take place here, above Nexera Prime, and the outcome would be the same. Xyloth asked what terms the humans demanded. Price transmitted a document that had been prepared by the United Earth government. It was simple and straightforward. The Council would recognize humanity as an independent civilization with full sovereignty over its territory. There would be no tribute, no oversight, and no interference in human affairs. In exchange, humanity would extend the same courtesy to Council space. They would not expand aggressively or threaten. Council worlds. The Council debated for 6 hours while the Colossus waited in orbit. Some representatives argued for rejecting the terms and fighting to the last ship. Others pointed out that they had already lost most of their fleet. A few suggested that perhaps coexistence with the humans was preferable to annihilation. In the end, the vote was unanimous. For the first time in 50,000 years, the Galactic Council agreed to terms dictated by another species. High Arbiter Xyloth transmitted the formal acceptance to the human vessel, his voice heavy with defeat. Price acknowledged the transmission and prepared to depart. Before activating the faster-than-light drive, he walked to the observation deck at the rear of the ship. Lieutenant Commander Amy Grant was already there, looking out at the alien world below. She asked him if he thought the aliens would keep their word. Price considered the question carefully before answering. He said that it did not matter. Humanity would continue building and preparing. They would expand their fleet and develop new technologies. They would establish colonies on distant worlds and forge alliances with any species willing to treat them with respect. If the Council honored the agreement, there would be peace. If they did not, humanity would be ready. Grant nodded, and they stood together in silence as the stars began to shift. The Colossus engaged its drive and vanished from Council space, leaving behind only the memory of what had occurred. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson on that day. Humans were small and short-lived. They came from an insignificant world in an unremarkable corner of the universe. But they were also stubborn and creative and absolutely refused to accept defeat. They had faced the greatest power in the known galaxy and emerged victorious. The Council would not forget. And neither would anyone else who heard the story of how humanity stood alone against the stars and won.